In note 6.4, example 8b, we're going to graph a general cosine function. Its equation is negative cosine 4x minus pi. And because we have both a horizontal dilation and a shift, we want to factor out the b value, which here is 4. So I'm going to factor out the 4. That'll leave me with x minus pi over 4. I do that so that I can identify the proper horizontal shift or the phase shift. Now we're going to go ahead and do our analysis, and as we do so, we're going to put key information on our graph. So the first thing we want to find is the axis of oscillation, or the midline. And to do that, we're going to look to see if this graph is shifted up or down at all. It is not. There's no d value. This will be plus 0. So the midline's at y equals 0, and I am going to go ahead and put that on my graph right away. Y equals 0. This is the midline. So put the midline here. Okay, the next thing we want to determine is the amplitude. So the amplitude comes from the value of a, which for this function is negative 1. We want the absolute value of that, so the amplitude is 1, which means this graph will move up 1 unit from the midline and down 1 unit. So I'm going to put a scale on my y-axis, which is always something you need to do. I'm going to do 2 squares is 1 unit. So my value for my maximum points will be at y equals 1, and the minimum, I'll go down 1, which is the amplitude from the midline, to y equals negative 1. And now we have created a nice envelope here inside which the cosine function will bounce up and down. Next thing we want to determine is the period. So put 3, the period. To find the period of a cosine function, we always take 2 pi, which is the period for the parent function, divided by b. In this case, b is 4, so it's 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. And what's going to be important for our graph is the key points. How often do they occur? So key points occur every 1/4 period. So this is going to be 1/4 times pi over 2, which is going to be pi over 8. And that's going to be helpful for our x scale, the scale on the x-axis. Next thing that we want to find is the starting point. So starting point. So if we can pick one point, since we know the pattern for cosine, we'll be able to graph all of the entire graph. So for cosine, for the parent function, a key point would be 0, 1. It starts at a maximum. And now let's transform this point. So what happens in terms of x and what happens to y? So in this function, x values are being multiplied by 1/4. That's what the b value of 4 means. So we're going to multiply x values by 1/4. And then in terms of a shift, this minus pi over 4 in the factored version means that points are shifted right pi over 4. So we're going to want to add pi over 4. So I'm going to do plus pi over 4 to x. So 0 times 1/4 is 0, so we're still at 0, 1. But 0 plus pi over 4 is pi over 4, 1. Okay, what's happening to y values? So y values here, we have this negative out in front, which means that y is multiplied by negative 1, and there's no shift vertically. So we're not going to add or subtract anything from y. So we'll multiply y by negative 1. So our starting point will be pi over 4, negative 1. So now we're going to start putting on the scale on our x-axis. So on the x-axis, we want to count by quarter periods, which will be pi over 8. So I'm going to let 2 lines be pi over 8. So I have pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, which is pi over 4, 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8, which is pi over 2, 5 pi over 8, and then 6 pi over 8, which is 3 pi over 4. And then I'll copy those values in the negative direction. So negative pi over 8, negative pi over 4, negative 3 pi over 8, and negative pi over 2. Now we're ready to graph. So we're going to take our starting point, which is here, pi over 4, -1, which is a minimum, and cosine starting at a minimum, we have no choice but to go up. And that makes sense because this is a reflected cosine because we have the -1 up in front. So now every quarter period we'll have a key point. So we'll be at 3 pi over 8, 0, pi over 2, 1, 5 pi over 8, 0, 3 pi over 4, -1, pi over 8, 0. I'm going to go in the other direction, just following the period, going from minimum to midline to maximum. And then we can go ahead and connect these with a nice smooth curve. And make sure you make rounded curves to put arrows at the end, and that is our function.